Have any of you ever attempted doing a rewrite? See a couple of hands here. Did it actually go as planned? Maybe did it take a lot longer than you thought? Or maybe was it actually a lot harder than you thought? If so, you're probably not alone. Rewrites are often met with skepticism because they can be notoriously difficult. What looks quite simple on the surface is often quite a complex project underneath. And there's a lot of complex business requirements, and all of that will end up in a long overrunning project. My name is Maria Neumayer, and I'm a principal engineer at Skyscanner. And when we proposed a rewrite of our hotels experience from React Native to native, we were met with similar skepticism. Was it actually worth the investment? How long was it really going to take? And will the end result actually be any better? So we wanted to get it right, and also prove them wrong a little. So how do you pull this off successfully? How do you accurately plan for the work, execute it well, and finally ship it successfully? Now, I'm not going to say we got it all right, and this is a recipe for success everywhere, but there's a few things that worked really well for us, and that we tackled different to any other project that we did before. So hopefully there's a few things in it for you as well. All right, let's take a look at what we did. Now, just like with any other project, it is really tempting to just dive straight into coding. Chances are you have a well-established way of building your features, and you actually know, or you think you know, what you're actually going to do. Maybe you know your product really well. You know exactly what it's doing and what you need to do to achieve this rewrite. But it's really important to take a step back and think about what you want to achieve and what steps you need to take to actually get there. Any refactor or rewrite, you're probably trying to achieve a few things. You're probably not doing a rewrite for no reason, especially because it would be quite hard to convince people of doing this. In our case, our main goal was to remove React Native, but on its own, that is not enough. So we really wanted to do it right. We wanted to have a really strong technical foundation. It had to be easy to maintain going forward. We wanted it to be fully accessible and also tested, and ensure we were using modern app concepts like Compose and SwiftUI. We really wanted to build in for the long term here, rather than just get a quick rewrite out of the way and then end up with a ton of tech debt. We also wanted to make sure that we weren't just looking at hotels in isolation. It had to be really well integrated into the rest of the application and aligned with our production standards, or even moving our production standards forward. As you might know, Skyscanner has 3 different verticals: flights, car hire, and hotels. And in the past, these were built in complete isolation. And that results in a lot of duplication and also inconsistencies between the 3. So we really wanted to take this opportunity to fix this. Before, with hotels being in React Native, it was very difficult to create this alignment because of all that bridging code that needs to be around this. So we really couldn't do this. But now, with aligning things on native, we could actually look at where we could create that alignment and really build with alignment in mind. So just like with the tech foundation, that meant investing a bit larger into this project and to make things more reusable than just building things just uniquely for hotels. And finally, we really want to make sure that our team working on this was confident in native development. The hotels team was mainly experienced in React Native, so they didn't have a lot of experience in native development. But at the end of the project, they had to be able to maintain it and expand it and work on it going forward. So they really had to know what they were doing and understand what the decisions we were making and why we were making them as we were doing this rewrite. So, aside from a fully native app, we had these 3 guiding principles: a strong technical foundation, a consistent experience, and a team that was confident in native development. And these 3 guiding principles not only helped us build the case for actually doing the rewrite in the first place, but they also helped us make decisions throughout the project. There's often different approaches you can take. So if you take a step back and think about what you actually want to achieve, it is much easier to make those decisions. And also, they helped us assemble the team for this project. We wanted to make sure that the team was supported by experienced native developers. And that meant the engineers had to have experience with our other verticals to really get the most advantage of getting that further alignment and making sure we had all that knowledge from all the other verticals as well. But also we wanted to make sure that our engineers had experience with Compose and SwiftUI. Particularly on the iOS side, we didn't have any SwiftUI code in the app yet, so this was really the first project that we were adopting it. So we wanted to make sure we had engineers on the project that actually knew it and actually could help us build this successfully. So essentially, we had a completely new team. And the first challenge was we had to figure out how we could actually work together. We not only had engineers from 5 different teams, but we were also based across China and the UK. And that meant we had to deal with the 7-hour time differences, but also different ways of working and different expertise areas across the whole project. And all of that we had to merge into one coherent team. Now, the most obvious challenge is the time difference, and that was something we just had to live with. With 7-hour time difference, you only have a couple of overlap each day. And even if you try to shift your days around, that's only workable to some extent. People have childcare and other commitments, or they just really don't want to get up early in the morning, or they just want to spend their evening with friends and family. So really, we just had a few hours of overlap every day. We had to rely on asynchronous communication a lot, and we had to make sure that we were documenting all our decisions to make sure that anybody catching up on things could actually know what was happening throughout the day. We also ensured we were pairing and collaborating a lot during this overlap period to make the most out of it. And that was helpful, but it was still really invaluable to actually get to know each other and actually meet in person and collaborate. Especially if you have a language barrier and cultural differences, it is very difficult to build that connection just over Zoom. So meeting in person really allows you to actually get to know each other and actually collaborate and also just have some fun together. And that allows you to build that personal connection that really makes building that project in the long term much, much easier. All right, so we got to know each other a little. And now we had to figure out what we actually had to build and how we were going to build this project. And one of the most important goals of this initial phase was knowledge sharing. As I mentioned, we had engineers from 5 different teams. We had engineers from the flights team, hotels team, design system, platform, as well as identity. And that meant we had expertise across pretty much the whole application. And so we really had all of the knowledge we needed to make this project a success. We didn't have to wait for anybody, hope they would be able to prioritize a change for us. We were in control of our project. And that was a huge, huge benefit. Maybe if you had a question for somebody on the team probably knew the answer, or at least who to talk to and how to get it. But on the flip side, everybody on the project was lacking knowledge important for the project, both from a technical but also from a product side of view. Our React Native engineers had limited experience in native development, especially using the latest tools like Compose and SwiftUI. But also on the native side, there were a lot of gaps. Design system and platform engineers like myself had very little experience in how feature development at Skyscanner worked. But also feature developers didn't know much about how to contribute components to a design system. All of those things we had to do throughout the project because we really wanted to build with that alignment in mind. Also on the product side, most of us native developers had very little knowledge about how the hotels product actually worked. So there was a lot of knowledge sharing that we had to do throughout of this project. We ran workshops, how to contribute to our design system, how our feature architecture works, and how the different technologies that we're using actually work and how we're using them. On the product side, we really dived deeply into the product. We were really lucky that the hotels team was really, really stable, so they knew their product in and out. But especially if you're not in that position, really dive deeply into the product before you actually start. Any product requirements can significantly change how you implement or structure your code. So you don't want to be caught up halfway down the project having to refactor everything just because you have to meet the product requirement that you could have known from the start. And when I say deeply, I really, really mean deeply. We went through every feature in the existing experience, every API call, every interaction, every item on the screen to gather as much knowledge of the requirements as possible. That is really, really important. A product looks very simple. If you just look at a screen, play around with it, you don't know what's actually happening under the hood. Where does the data come from? What is actually happening when you click on an item? All of this can really bring out a lot of complexities. So you really want to make sure you know what you have to do and what you're dealing with. We also worked really closely with product to really look at what the product requirements were, rather than just taking the implementation as it was for granted. What was actually the reason for behavior, and how critical was it to do this? And that is especially important if something was really difficult to implement, because we could challenge, was it actually needed? Was it worth putting all this effort in to support this? Or could we actually take a much simpler approach that would still support that product requirement? Or maybe we could actually drop it, because it actually wasn't used much. If you do make those decisions, make sure you document them. That is super valuable later down the line when you're implementing. Particularly if you make a lot of these decisions, later on you will forget what decisions you actually made. So you really want to make sure you have a decision log that you can refer back to. In these decision logs, we described what the problem actually was, which options we actually considered, what the pros and cons were, and then also what the complexity of implementing that was. And that not only helped us making our decision, but later on, when you actually were implementing something, you could actually refer back to it and look at what the decision was and why. Now, it is really important to be clear about what is actually part of your rewrite when you tackle this project. Chances are your product is not going to be exactly the same version as it was before, but rather an evolved version of it. For us, we really wanted to stay as close as possible to the existing experience to avoid any risk when we were rolling out this change. We didn't want to be in this position where we couldn't remove React Native because a product change wasn't successful. So we couldn't actually roll out this whole refactor just because we tried to make a little product change. But we did want to make sure that we were more aligned with the rest of the product, and that meant being 100% aligned with our design system, for example. That doesn't mean we redesigned the whole experience, we really just made small, subtle changes that meant we didn't have to implement a component from scratch when there was already one there that was 90% supporting what we needed. And we could also look at where we could create those reusable components across our verticals to make sure we were creating one experience rather than 3 separate ones. We really worked closely with product to also look at what the future vision for the product was, to make sure that what we were building was going to be compatible with it. So even if we weren't actually including something in the rewrite, we could still consider it and make sure it was supported later on. We also adopted anything that was experimented with on web successfully, or left out features that were not used that much. Really look at your data here rather than making assumptions. But if you can include those subtle changes and make that new experience better, it'll be good. But you want to make sure that you're not including anything risky. So make sure everything is tested and you have the data to back it up. All of that really allowed us to stay focused and avoid that scope creep that usually happens in these types of projects. So really be consistent about this. It is really, really easy to sneak in a change here and there, and suddenly what you're building is much, much bigger. As engineers, we often want to build that perfect solution, but really take a step back. Think, do we actually need to include this in a rewrite, or can we include that later on and add it once we've shipped everything? Your API doesn't have to be perfect, your feature doesn't have to be perfect. It is more important to get it out first than actually having that perfect solution. All right, so we knew what we wanted to build, and now we had to figure out how. And because of all these product deep dives, we already knew some of the complexities we had to resolve when we were tackling this project. How do we communicate between different parts of the screen? Or how do we share data or state across different screens? Or how do we actually create these reusable components across our verticals? All of these were challenges we knew, and we had to resolve. And for this, we did a ton of system designs. And that had a few benefits. First, we could actually iron out any issues with the approach. Was something working? What is the best approach to actually tackle these problems? But also get disagreements out of the way before we got into things into code. It is much easier to adapt things on a whiteboard than having to refactor things later on. So before we wrote a single line of code, we knew how we were going to build things. Secondly, we could have those conversations jointly across Android and iOS, and really have a shared understanding of how we were going to build things. We always wanted to make sure that we were aligned about how we were going to do things, to make sure we ended up with the same product, but also that we could actually discuss issues as well as implementation details across platforms. And thirdly, we could involve everybody. We could really work on this collaboratively rather than just a single person or maybe a pair working on the code. And that is especially valuable for us, because we had to get everybody up to speed, both from a product, but also from a technical point of view. Sure, before we started this project, we walked everybody through our feature architecture, we walked through the product, but it is still much, much more concrete to actually look at what you're building than just something theoretical. But all this planning isn't going to be perfect. There are things you're going to miss. There are things you're going to make where you're going to make the wrong assumptions. It's very different mapping things out on a whiteboard than actually writing code. But it still gives us a really good idea of how we were going to implement things and avoid any confusion later down the line. It's also going to be tiring, especially if you're doing it in a large group or over a small period of time. We did a lot of this planning in our trip to Shenzhen to really get the most out of being in the same room. But that meant at the end of the day, everybody was really, really wiped out. This time was super valuable. We got a lot done, but it was intense. We also realized that those conversations were often held by a small group of people, as it usually is the case in those large groups. So to improve those things, we decided to split into some smaller groups and also smaller sessions to get some more focus. In those smaller groups, everybody could focus on different parts of the app. In those smaller groups, we could actually go into a lot more detail. We actually mapped out everything that had to be done. We created a list of tickets, essentially, that had to be created, even did some small estimations and added any considerations that you have to take when you tackle this problem. And in those smaller groups, everybody was engaged and everybody was contributing. And we could also parallelize things a lot more and speed up the whole process. We could also make sure that we were actually creating ownership. Every problem had a different set of owners, and we made sure that these owners were matched up with everybody's background. So if somebody had experience in maps, they would focus on maps, and that doesn't mean just working on that experience within that hotel site, but also from other companies or even working in other projects at Skyscatter. And that ownership we kept throughout the project. That doesn't mean those engineers were the only ones working on the feature as well. We didn't want to create silos either. But it really allowed us to distribute the planning and project management across the whole team that you have to do throughout these large projects. And also, it gave you somebody you could ask questions. Those owners usually were the ones who were most familiar with the project or with the area. So they're the ones you would go to first if you had any questions. And finally, we did all of that planning in Miro. And that allowed us to create documentation. Even if you had conversations in person, we would make sure that we reflect them later on in Miro to make sure nothing was lost. So, because of all the system design and all of the list of tasks we created, creating tickets as well as the implementation later on was much easier. Oftentimes, when you're in the middle of implementing your ticket, you were like, hey, didn't we talk about this at some point? And usually there was a design log or a system design that would refer back to it, and you had the answer right there. Now, as I mentioned before, one of our goals was to have that better alignment across our 3 verticals. And that could mean a lot of different things. We could build something fully flexible and dynamic. Hey, maybe we could support space travel. Doesn't matter. Or we could just create reusable components, or just extract and use what was already there. In our case, something fully dynamic was out of scope. We knew that would just add a lot of them dependencies onto other teams who would have to resolve a lot of problems that we wouldn't have to resolve right now. It was not the right time to tackle this. But we did want to have that more alignment across the different verticals and made sure we weren't just creating another version of the same thing just for hotels. And that balance is hard. Creating something usable is a lot harder, but it is also a lot more valuable. So the general approach we followed here was, is something already there? Is it in a good state? Maybe it is already extracted. Even if it isn't perfect, we could use it, extract it, and just use it as it was there. Or if something was actually quite a lot of legacy code, maybe it was really tightly coupled to a feature already, it didn't make a lot of sense to try and extract this. We could rather build something from scratch that was actually following the latest standards, and then that other team could actually move towards that solution. But we made sure that it was actually reusable, rather than just specific for a hotel. And finally, maybe something was actually quite specific. There wasn't a lot of reason to actually create something reusable there, in which case we could just build something bespoke. Okay, so that is a lot of planning. But I really think that was really, really important for us to really make this project a success. You really need to think about what it is you need to take, to do, how much effort you need to put into this, and really know when you actually start coding that you know what you're doing, rather than trying to figure out everything as you're trying to build this. So, because of all this planning, we had a solid plan. We pretty much knew what we had to do and how we were going to do this. Sure, we missed some details and there were some complexities we discovered later on, but a large of the amounts of problems were already solved before we wrote a single line of code. Now, one of the first things we did when it came to implementing things, even while we were still planning our work, was to contribute components to our design system. And that meant everybody could learn compose in SwiftUI on some very simple components. If you're adopting any new technology, that is super valuable because everybody can just ease into this new technology. They don't have to learn everything around it. They don't have to worry about how the feature architecture works, how your product works. They can really learn that new technology on a small scale. But once we finished planning, one of our first goals was to really verify what we were designing on paper was actually working in code. And here we took what we called a skeleton approach. Essentially, we built all of the empty building blocks, all of the different layers and components that were needed, with a focus on the communication between them. We left out all the details. Those could be added later on. Maybe we added some dummy implementation just to make sure that we could verify the approach. But that allowed us to really make sure we could actually confirm the approach was working and also unblock all of the other parts of development. And that was especially valuable for us because we were a relatively large team. So we didn't want to make sure we wanted to make sure that we weren't stepping on each other's toes. Because of this approach, it was really, really quick to get a feature up and running simultaneously. It's really exciting to see how quickly things come together if you follow this approach, as everybody can work on a different part, and suddenly everything comes together nicely. That approach worked really, really well for us, so we kept adopting it as we moved to other parts of the project. So first, we do that system design. We do that whiteboarding and figure out how we were going to build things. And then we did the skeleton. We built all the building blocks and verified the approach. And finally, we implemented all of these details. Just one bit of caution when you follow this approach. It is very important to be very clear about what is actually part of the skeleton and what will be implemented in individual tickets later on. It is really, really easy to get carried away here and go much further than you actually need to. But that makes reviewing the change quite hard, but also you might miss a lot of details because you're not really focusing on them. So really focus on the building blocks and then resolve the details later on and really give them the attention they actually need so you don't miss anything. We also found pairing and group design really valuable for these skeletons. We could bounce ideas off each other's, but also get people up to speed with the approach and make sure everybody understood what we were planning to do here. In general, we did a lot of pairing and collaboration. We had one-off coding pairing sessions, but also we had actual regular pairing sessions that were just in our calendar. And in those, people could just ask questions, or they could get some help with a ticket they were working on, where they weren't sure how to approach something. Or we could just do a system design together. After every sprint planning session, we had a ticket implementation meeting where we went through all of the tickets in the sprint. Here, we could talk about how could we approach the different problems. Maybe we did a system design, or we could just answer any questions or unknowns somebody might have when they wanted to adopt this, pick up this ticket. And that meant when it came to code review, there weren't any major questions anymore or any major surprises, which sped up that process a lot, which is very valuable if you have a big time difference. So you don't have to wait for the other person to wake up to then tell you that you have to change everything again. Now, that sounds like a lot of meetings, but all of them were fully optional. If you knew what you were going to do, if you were deep down in a project, you didn't have to go to these. But if you have a lot of unknowns and a lot of knowledge sharing to do, it's really, really valuable to provide these spaces. Not everybody's going to be comfortable reaching out to somebody and asking a question, especially if you don't know each other well yet. So providing these spaces really gives everybody an opportunity to just ask a question in a very small space without having to worry about interrupting somebody. And just with planning, we tried to align as much as possible across our platform when it came to actually implementing things. We followed a similar architecture approach, but also did things like domain modeling together. And all of that allowed us to, when it came to implementing a feature, we could actually resolve any unknowns or questions on one platform and then follow a similar approach on the other. We essentially ended up staggering our approaches. So if one platform started working on filters, the other might have started on maps to really get as much advantage of this as possible. Also, we made sure we documented our findings. So if a piece of work was quite complex on one platform, it often was easy to do on the other because we already resolved all of the difficulties, worked out all of the details, and documented them. Or at least you had somebody you could go and, hey, how did he do this? And maybe you got an answer, or maybe that person actually missed doing this. Okay, now you might think, all of this effort, why not just use Kotlin multi-platform? It's a very hot topic, there's a lot of talks here at DroidCon, but in our case, we really wanted to make sure this project was as risk-free as possible. We didn't want to add a lot of unknowns and complications in our tech stack, and Kotlin multi-platform would have done that. We would have essentially have to have 2 cross-platform systems in the app at the same time, and have to deal with all that build tooling and CI overhead that goes with it. So really be conscious about the impact of the technologies that you're using. Not everything that is popular is going to be applicable in your project. Or maybe it is not the right moment at that time. In our case, the risk and overhead of using KMP was a lot higher than the benefit of it. Now, that doesn't mean it's not going to be an option in the future, but we really have to simplify things and remove React Native first before we can consider it. In general, we tried to avoid surprises as much as possible. We ended up prioritizing a lot of the complexities early on to really get a clear understanding of what we actually had to be doing here. It's really important not to make assumptions here. If you have any unknowns, you really want to turn them into knowns sooner rather than later. You don't want to be in that position where just before you try to release something, you need to do that little thing that you thought was going to be super easy, and it's going to turn out to be really, really difficult and delay the whole project. Now, I'm not going to say do all of the complexities right at the start. It is important to have focus as well. And tackling a project from start to end is also really, really useful because you can learn so much from it and just adopt that in all of the other parts of the project. But if you do have a choice between something that is easy and something that is complex, do the complex thing first. We did a lot of investigations in those complexities before we even implemented it. So sometimes that just meant looking at the React Native code. What was it actually doing here? In other cases, it actually meant spiking out their work, seeing how are we going to tackle this. We could try different approaches and solutions and find solutions without having to implement the whole thing, similar to how we tackled these skeletons. Now that code was usually more playing around with it. It wasn't production ready, so that doesn't mean we merged this code at the end, but it was still a really good base for actually reference for whoever implemented it later on. So because of all of these investigations and prioritizations we did early on, we had a lot of confidence in our approach. And we didn't have that nagging, is this thing going to bite us at some point feeling that you might have otherwise. Throughout the project, we constantly listened to feedback and adapted our approaches if something isn't working. A lot of the things I'm talking about came out of retros or other things that somebody raised that wasn't really working well for people. You might also find that what works in one phase of the project doesn't really work well in another. At the start of the project, we really had to over-index on knowledge sharing and learning a lot because we had to really make sure everybody was on the same page. But later down the line, that was less critical because everybody learned already so much and had a lot more confidence. So really reevaluate what works and what doesn't. Just because something worked for us doesn't necessarily mean it'll work for you. Every problem is different, and every team is different. And it's going to have different challenges. But be open to adapting things, even if it's something you've always done. And finally, really have fun. I really think a big driver for how we pulled this off successfully was that everybody really wanted to do this. Everybody was fully committed and enjoyed working on this. It wasn't just another project we all had to do. Not every project is going to have that excitement or get that, but it is really better if a team wants to do it than if it needs to do it begrudgingly. So really find that selling point, or maybe find what is actually in it for you. Maybe it's a new technology that is being adopted as part of the project. Maybe it's just an interesting product challenge, or maybe you can just finally remove React Native. We even managed to embrace the time difference a little. Sometimes if you push the pull request at the end of the day, or maybe you were struggling with something, and you just put the question in Slack. The next morning you woke up, logged onto Slack, there's an answer. Maybe your pull request is approved. We also managed to have focus time. A lot of the meetings and catch-ups we had during this small overlap period, and that meant the rest of the day was uninterrupted, which is perfect for coding. Now, one more thing I want to talk about, and that is focus. We were very, very lucky that we were able to convince our leadership of this project, and that was important enough to actually let us focus on this. And that is immensely useful. We didn't have to do this on the side. We didn't have to constantly context switch between this and other projects. And not everybody's going to be as lucky as this. I could do a whole talk about convincing leadership of these projects. But even if you can't focus on it fully, see where you can get those focus blocks. Maybe planning is important. Maybe a particularly hairy project that you need to do. But really try and focus on these and not try and do them on the side. It is very, very hard to sustain these projects over a long period of time if you just try and do it on the side, because you're constantly playing catch up with any other changes that are happening around you. Or even better, try and slice it up and turn it more into a refactor than a rewrite. In our case, that was difficult because we could only really do a migration from React Native to native per screen. Everything else would have just added a lot more complexities and make this project that was already complex even more difficult. All right, you might have checked the app and seen, how's this new cool hotels experience? And seen, yes, this is still very much using React Native. But we are very close to shipping our first and most complex screen, our hotels search, after a bit over 3 months. We definitely have had our ups and downs, and maybe it'll still fall apart while we're trying to ship this. But because of this approach, I'm very confident that we'll make it a success and that there won't be any major surprises. And thanks to all that knowledge sharing, the next screens will be a lot easier because we already know the product so much better and how to build it. Not everything went perfect. We definitely missed things, got things wrong, and took a wrong approach here and there, often because we weren't following our own advice here. But I'm still really proud of what we achieved so far. Now, talked a lot about this in the context of rewrites, but a lot of these approaches I took here, you can take in any other project. Like any other project, rewrites are hard. They take time and they take focus. There is no silver bullet to making them successful. So, really take a step back. Think about what it is you want to achieve. Plan the work carefully to really fully understand what and how you can build it. Communicate constantly. Really focus on knowledge sharing to be able to spread knowledge across the whole team and make sure that everybody's on the same page and confident in making changes. And finally, iterate on your approach. Really learn from your mistakes, but also from your successes to keep getting better and improving. All of these 3 principles really helped us to get there and make this project a success. So hopefully they will help you with your next migration as well. Thank you.